Okay, let's talk a little bit about the science and political science. All science relies on comparison. Why? Think of a classic experiment. An experiment compares a treatment group to a control group. The treatment group, of course, is the group of people or animals who receive a modification, a treatment. The control group, of course, is the group that is either left alone or who receives a placebo. Only by comparing what happens to each group can we really decide whether a particular treatment has an effect. So in that sense, even the most classic of science is comparative. Political science, of course, is rarely experimental. We can't really play around with countries in the name of science. But if we're going to be able to learn anything about systematic causes and effects in the world, we can still compare the imperfect data that we do observe. Then what we usually do is use fancy statistical tools to correct for the problem. Now, there's a way in which all political science is fundamentally comparative. When Americanists study American government, they're usually comparing current Congress to past Congresses, or the current president to past presidents. This is another form of comparison. When comparativists study countries, they compare one country to another. For comparativists, the United States of America is just another country case. It's a special case, to be sure, but it's still just one case of many. In fact that America is so different from most countries in the world makes it an awkward case to draw lessons from. In a scientific experiment, you wouldn't want to draw medical conclusions from only your largest and your strongest specimen. You'd probably want to look at the average, and then of course look at the dispersion, the entire range of outcomes. But for most of my students, America is not just another country, it's their country. To be a good student of comparative politics, however, and a good scientist more generally, you have to be able to step back a little bit from your own biases and assumptions. And that means you have to step back from your status as an American and take a more impartial point of view. Now, social sciences, like political science, differ from the natural sciences in several key ways. We already mentioned there are no experiments in political science. It's hard to reproduce results. We can't rerun history with the same actors, only changing one or two variables. And we certainly can't play around with countries in the name of science. Second, people are not like elements or atoms. People change their behavior. People evolve. People can decide how to react. And not all people are the same. Every piece of copper more or less behaves like every other piece of copper, but every human being does not behave more or less like every other human being. So that makes things a little bit more difficult when we are trying to study human beings. And of course, this is true at the global level, but it's also true at the country level. Not every American reacts like every other American, and not every Republican reacts like every other Republican, and not every Tennessean reacts like every other Tennessean. So there's a huge amount of variation with human beings that make them very difficult and very different to study than elements or atoms. Another difference between social sciences and the natural sciences is that a lot of the most interesting variables in the social sciences can be really hard to measure. How do you measure a country's culture? How do you measure democracy? These are difficult things to measure. Not impossible, but difficult. And a fourth kind of difference is that the kind of knowledge that you obtain from the social sciences, like political science, is not always action guiding. Or you might say it's not always policy relevant in the case of political science. If I know that on average the minimum wage law increases the cost of labor and increases the prices of goods by such and such a number, that doesn't tell me what that minimum wage increase will do in a particular time and place. All I know is the average number. But knowing the average doesn't help guide my actions in any particular time or place. And so that means that unlike principles of engineering, which will pretty much always tell you how to build bridges in every circumstance that you can imagine, because physics doesn't change, at least on this planet that we know of. Political science knowledge can't really tell us how to design society or design policies because typically all we know is an average. What we don't have is a knowledge of time and place that could help us guide our action. However, all that being said, political science does share some key features with the natural sciences as well. Political scientists carefully define their concepts so that everybody knows what they're talking about. They carefully measure their variables and justify how they're measuring their variables. Political scientists also look for opportunities to test hypotheses. opportunities to test hypotheses might come along in the form of what we call a natural experiment. So for instance, if unexpectedly North Carolina raises or lowers the minimum wage in its state, or raises or lowers the number of weeks that people can stay on unemployment, that's going to affect behavior of individuals in that state. And since they had no foreknowledge of this, we can hope that differences in behavior before and after the change in the minimum wage or the change in the number of weeks people are eligible for unemployment, the change in behavior is in fact a result of the change in the law. Another thing that links political science to science in general is that we're looking for general knowledge. We're not just looking to know about what happened in a particular time and place. We're not telling stories. We are trying to tell stories with a moral to them, or some sort of generalizable maxim that we can say, okay, across a certain range of cases, and it might not be all cases, we might not say all countries behave this way, but we might be able to say that democracies behave this way, or a particular kind of democracies, like parliamentary democracies, might behave in one way or another. Another way that natural science and political science are alike is that both sets of scholars submit their studies to public scrutiny. Everything is out there in the open, the method, the data, everything is out there to be looked at by anybody else. There's no secrecy about it, which means that it's open to criticism. Everything is always open to revision and to criticism, and this is a very important part of the scientific method that political science is generally ascribed to. And finally, only be as confident as the evidence allows. Political science and people who do political science tend to be confident just as much as the evidence allows you to be confident. If the data is bad or if the concepts aren't particularly well defined, then they're less confident, just like natural scientists. But if the evidence is good, if the concepts are well measured, and the studies are well designed, then we can be a little bit more confident that the knowledge that we've accumulated is in fact accurate. So there's ways in which doing political science is harder than doing natural science. As I mentioned, people change, cultures evolve, institutions change their rules, states appear and disappear. What was true at one time may no longer be true now. And many of the concepts, like democracy or development, are not natural kinds that we can find out there independent of our perception of them. There's a sense in which political and economic development are concepts that depend on what we think they are. It's not like copper or water, which exists out there regardless of how we perceive them. Now, despite all of this, studying comparative politics can be worthwhile if we can accumulate knowledge bit by bit, or at least reject false claims bit by bit. The hope is that by testing our hypotheses, we can do for our social world what the sciences did for the physical world. We can learn to build and or nurture societies in productive ways and avoid the most destructive forms of social organization. As always, if you have questions about this lecture, feel free to get in touch.